The final stage of the case research process involves creating your deliverable and taking that deliverable into publication. And there is not going to be any really generalizable way of describing how you should write up a case. So what I will just briefly do is talk about two formats, the format of the discussion case and the format of the research case, and identify how they are similar and how they are different. So both your discussion case and your research case are going to begin with an introduction. In the discussion case, the focus is going to be what decision does the protagonist need to address or need to make. And in the research case, it's more a question of what research questions are we trying to answer by conducting this research. Now, in the discussion case, the next thing that's going to likely happen is we're going to introduce the reader to the environment in which the decision being discussed is being made. In a research case, we're more likely to have a literature review, essentially identifying, well, what has already been written about this in the past? What do we already know? What theories are out there? So, like the environment in the discussion case, it's designed to get the reader to better understand the context in which the problem is being considered. In a discussion case, the next thing you're going to probably do is give some background on the organization. All of this is in narrative form. Whereas in a research case, you're probably going to introduce the research framework. And the research framework is likely to consider, focus on, okay, what theories are you using in conducting your research? If you're doing hypothesis testing, which is a lot less common in case research than it is in other qualitative or social science research techniques, you would want to sort of put those there. But essentially here what we're doing is we're telling the reader what theoretical framework that we're going to be using in telling our story and analyzing our story. Once you're done with those sections, then in the discussion case, we keep moving down to more and more details. So in the discussion case, after we've talked about the organization, we will probably talk about the locale in which the case is being conducted. Whereas in a research case, once we've given the theoretical framework, we're going to establish the methodology. And for research cases, much of the methodology is going to involve how we are gathering and analyzing data. So I've called that the data gathering protocol, because that's what we're going to be really interested in when we're evaluating a research case, because the thing we're really concerned about is, was this done in a systematic and objective way? So, of course, we're going to emphasize triangulation, because triangulation is absolutely critical in research cases. In the discussion case, we moved down another level of detail. We've moved into the localized unit where the decision is being made, and now we're going to discuss the decision maker. In the research case, we have the background and situation. This is where we actually have the case narrative, and this may very well be the longest portion of the research case write-up, because here is where we actually describe the case. Next level, in the discussion case, we focus on the situation that is the basis for the decision that is being made. In our research case, we jump over and start our analysis. So we've given a narrative, and there may be some analysis that's conducted along the way as part of the narrative, but most of the analysis are going to be in the context of this section. And here is where we take the theory that is driving our case research, and we take the findings from the case in the background and situation area, and we take a look and see how well the theory applies to the background and situation. Here is really where you're establishing the findings of your research. As we come to the end of the discussion case, we talk about the constraints and choices on the decision, and we kind of reiterate the decision. This focuses the reader's attention on the task at hand, which is making recommendations, and we follow that with exhibits, and these exhibits essentially identify materials from the case that should be considered in analyzing it for discussion purposes. In the research case, we actually have a discussion, because the purpose of the research case is not to generate discussion, but it's to frame discussion for the research reader. And in some cases, if our analysis supports the theory, we'll emphasize that. If our analysis doesn't, in the discussion section, we might introduce new potential concepts or theories that might better explain the case. In that case, we're dealing with something a little bit along the lines of grounded theory, because research cases are often exploratory in nature, as I've emphasized, and for that reason, sometimes our explorations lead to a new theory. Finally, we reach the conclusion section of the research case, and that's going to be pretty much like the conclusions of any other research. Typically, you don't want them too long, and somewhere in here you might put directions for future research. I don't like putting those in conclusions, because it's basically like concluding that I need to do more work before I produce anything useful. Sometimes I will put some of those after the discussion section, but to some extent, in research cases, it's not absolutely critical that you incorporate all that stuff, because chances are you're not going to be going back to the same organization and gathering more data, or at least you hope you won't be. That probably depends upon your reviewers. Hopefully, by the time you have your case written up, you're on such great terms with the organization that the question of case release is not a major issue. And if you've done your homework, as I suggested at the very beginning, and outlined the process and how cases get released, there should not be any surprises. Nevertheless, many publishing outlets will require that you have some sort of a release document on any case they want to publish. And so the very end of the case process involves getting approval from the organization or organizations that were involved in the case study. So what are some of the items that you want to cover in the approval document? And we'll start with copyright and duplicating rights, which tend to be about the same thing. A copyright basically gives you, the copyright holder, the ability to control the distribution of the document, which of course includes duplicating. And when you are dealing with a research case, the copyright is going to initially reside with the author, you as the investigator. You could turn it over to the organization, but I would not recommend doing so. But when you submit it for publication, there are two possible things that can happen. One is, if you're dealing with a sort of traditional academic publisher, the publisher is going to want the copyright, which means that once you turn that copyright over to the publisher, you can no longer control the distribution of your article. The other possibility is if you're dealing with an open access publisher, the increasing standard is for the copyright to remain with the author. So you remain in control of the document, but you have to sign over the rights to publish it to the publisher. If the publisher holds the copyright, you may want to ensure that the organization that you've been dealing with has the right to duplicate the case for use internally. If you give them that right before you go to the publisher, chances are the publisher is not going to object, and they'll carve out the right of the organization to copy and distribute the case within its own boundaries. If you do not give the organization that right up front, once the document is published, there is a possibility the publisher may say, well, of course you can copy it, but it's going to cost you $60 per copy, or whatever they're charging on the web. So you may want to think about that, because you do not want to piss your organizational clients off as a result of being unable to use the research that they participated in developing. It's very important to make sure that organizations understand that once a case has been published, they cannot recall the case. So certainly with discussion cases, but even with research cases, until you get a final approval of the document, there's always the risk that the organization will say, sorry, we've changed our minds. We do not want you publishing this. We do not want you showing it to anyone. And you just have to accept that risk. And the best way to avoid that risk is to keep in touch with the organization and make sure that the organization understands and is happy with what you're doing. But once it's been published, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle, and organizations need to understand that once it's published, it will no longer be under your control as to whether it continues to be available. A decade ago or 2 decades ago, this often required a lot of explanation to organizations. Now, with the way things have been distributed on the internet, I think most organizations understand that you cannot put a genie back into the bottle if it's out on the internet. One important thing that you need to think about when an organization is approving the case is that if you're going to submit it to peer review, there are very likely going to be situations where the editors request specific revisions that be made, that is, the editors and reviewers, and you will have to modify the case. What you want to make sure is when the organization approves the case, they give you some leeway to make modifications without going through a reapproval process. Typically, a publisher is going to want to have an approval document if a case study involves an organization, particularly a commercial organization. With government organizations, it's not so important because a lot of government organizations are required by law to have their material in the public domain by default. And so as a consequence, they really don't have a lot of ability to control their information. But when you're dealing with private companies, you do not want them in a situation where they're suing the publisher, or rather the publisher does not want that to be the situation. And so the publisher is going to look for some sort of a release. What I recommend is ensuring the release document gives you enough leeway so that you can make standard modifications in response to reviewers without requiring a reapproval. That may involve a certain amount of negotiating because it's hard to know how much revision requires reapproval and how much does not. But you might just choose someone in the organization who can look at a revised version and, with a simple nod indicate that the changes aren't too material. I have not run into this problem with research cases, but I recognize that is something that could exist. Another thing you can do is get one of the individuals from the organization added to the case as a co-author. Once it's added to the case as a co-author, then really the problem of authorization it falls out of your domain and into the domain of the individual who is a co-author working within the organization. And publishers will generally accept that. At the end of a lot of these agreements, we've got stuff like consequential damages, good faith, and arbitration. We see this in a lot of organizational agreements, and research cases typically are very unlikely to be the source of lawsuits based upon damages caused to the organization because someone read the case and something bad happened. And most organizations prefer an arbitration clause as opposed to the risk of having you sue them. I would tend to just allow the organization's legal department, if they're involved, to decide what these clauses are. I don't think they matter very much, but what you don't want to do is spook the person improving the case. And so to the greatest extent possible, you can let the organization decide what they think is most appropriate. Well, that pretty much covers all the elements of the writing research case studies checklist. And this is just intended to be a sort of a list that will help you think about things. It's very rare that you would have to deal with every item in this checklist, and it's equally rare that you won't have to deal with any items in the checklist. So hopefully this will provide a useful way of thinking about the case writing process when it actually comes time to do case research.